every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. It begins with a single drop of blood, an almost mystical concept, a pinprick on the finger, a tiny crimson sphere holding the universe of your body's secrets. Imagine a world where that single drop is all it takes. No more terrifying needles, drawing vial after vial from your arm. No more agonizing waits for lab results. Instead, instant knowledge, the power to detect disease, to monitor your health, to take control of your own biology, all from a small, elegant box in your local pharmacy. This was the promise. It was a promise so profound, so deeply resonant with our most basic fears and hopes about our own mortality, that it felt less like an invention and more like a destiny. It was a story so perfect it had to be true, and at the center of this destiny was a figure seemingly forged for the role, Elizabeth Holmes. She appeared as if from central casting, a Silicon Valley oracle for a new age. The uniform was iconic, a black turtleneck, a deliberate homage to her hero, Steve Jobs. The voice was a surprisingly deep, measured baritone, a voice that commanded attention and projected an unshakable confidence. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to look not just at you, but through you, into a future that only she could see. She was a prodigy who had dropped out of Stanford's prestigious chemical engineering program at 19, armed with a vision that would, she claimed, change the world. The company she founded, Theranos, was not just a startup, it was a revolution, and the world's most powerful people believed her. Rupert Murdoch invested $125 million. Larry Ellison, the titan of Oracle, was an early backer. The Walton family, founders of Walmart, invested $150 million. Her board of directors was a breathtaking assembly of American power and prestige. Two former secretaries of state, George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, a future Secretary of Defense, General James Mattis, a former Secretary of Defense, William Perry. These were not flighty, impressionable individuals. They were pillars of the political, financial, and military establishment. Their presence on the board was more than an endorsement. It was a stamp of unimpeachable legitimacy. And so, the money poured in. Theranos was valued at over $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes, who owned half the company, became on paper the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. The media crowned her the next Steve Jobs. She was the star of magazine covers, of TED Talks, of global conferences. She was living proof of the Silicon Valley dream. But behind the black turtlenecks, behind the unblinking stare and the deep voice, behind the closed doors of Theranos headquarters in Palo Alto, a very different story was unfolding. It was a story of fear, of paranoia, of a suffocating culture of secrecy where employees were tracked, intimidated, and legally threatened into silence. And at its core, it was a story about a technology that simply did not work. The elegant black box, the machine named Edison that was supposed to run hundreds of tests from a pinprick of blood, was a fiction, a mirage. The revolutionary promise was built on a foundation of profound and dangerous deception. Today, we dissect the anatomy of a corporate fraud. This isn't a case of a product that failed to meet its hype. This is an exploration of a lie so vast and so meticulously constructed that it held the world captive for more than a decade. We will examine the psychology of a uniquely captivating manipulator and the Silicon Valley culture of fake it till you make it that provided the fertile ground for her deception to grow. We will trace the intricate web of influence, power, and belief that protected a billion-dollar myth, and we will follow the courageous individuals who risked everything to expose it. This is the anatomy of a lie that put thousands of real lives at risk. A lie that began and almost ended with the promise of a single drop of blood. Elizabeth Ann Holmes was born into a world of aspiration and connections. Her family history was steeped in tales of entrepreneurship and ambition. Her great-great-great-grandfather founded Fleischmann's Yeast, a company that became a giant of American industry. Her father, Christian Holmes, IV, was a former vice president at the energy giant Enron, which would later collapse in its own notorious accounting scandal. After Enron, he held positions at government agencies like USAID, and the family moved between Washington, D.C. and Houston, inhabiting a world of policy, influence, and quiet prestige. This background gave Elizabeth a sense of comfort and familiarity with the corridors of power, and ease in the presence of influential people that would later prove to be one of her most potent assets. From a young age, Elizabeth was described as intense, driven, and singularly focused. The now famous letter she supposedly wrote to her father at the age of 9 reportedly stated her life's ambition. "What I really want out of life is to discover something new, something that mankind didn't know was possible to do." This narrative of a child prodigy destined for greatness would become a cornerstone of the Theranos myth, repeated endlessly in media profiles. It was the perfect origin story for a tech messiah. Her academic path was stellar. She excelled in high school, and with her fluency in Mandarin, which she honed by starting a business selling C++ compilers to Chinese universities, she secured a spot in Stanford University's elite chemical engineering program in 2002. Stanford is the crucible of Silicon Valley, the place where world-changing ideas are expected to be born in dorm rooms. And Elizabeth Holmes was determined to deliver one. The initial spark for Theranos reportedly came from her stated fear of needles, a relatable and powerful origin story. During a summer internship at the Genome Institute of Singapore, she worked on detecting the SARS coronavirus from blood samples using traditional methods like syringes and PCR machines. The process seemed clumsy and inefficient to her. The vision began to form, a wearable patch that could analyze a patient's blood in real time through microneedles and administer necessary medication. It was a grand, futuristic idea. When she returned to Stanford, she took this idea to her chemical engineering professor, Channing Robertson. Robertson was an academic star, known for his work in microfluidics. By his own account, he was completely blown away by her. He would later say that in a 30-year career, he had met few students with her level of drive and intellect. He became her champion, her mentor, and eventually the first member of the Theranos board, lending his considerable academic credibility to her nascent enterprise. But not everyone was so captivated. Holmes also pitched her concept to Dr. Phyllis Gardner, a professor of medicine at Stanford. Gardner, an expert in clinical pharmacology, listened to the pitch and immediately saw its fundamental flaws. She explained to the young student that the idea was simply impossible from a scientific and medical perspective. You couldn't get a large enough or pure enough sample of blood through microneedles for reliable analysis, and the concept of a patch that could diagnose and then treat a wide range of diseases was pure science fiction. Gardner's reaction was unequivocal. "I told her, I don't think your idea is going to work." She was struck by Holmes's response. Instead of engaging with the scientific critique, Holmes simply stared back at her, unblinking, As if Gardner's expert opinion was an irrelevant obstacle, the rejection did not cause her to reconsider. It only hardened her resolve. In 2003, at the age of 19, Holmes dropped out of Stanford, using her tuition money as seed capital. She founded a company she initially called Real-Time Cures, a name later deemed too suggestive for regulatory purposes. With the help of a branding agency, she landed on Theranos, a portmanteau of therapy and diagnosis. The name was sleek, futuristic, and vaguely medical, perfectly calibrated for the world she was trying to build. The central promise was the Edison machine, later followed by a model named the Minilab. It was pitched as a small automated device that could perform a vast menu of blood tests, over 200, she claimed, from a single drop of blood collected from a finger prick in a tiny vial they called a nanotainer. This was the holy grail of diagnostics. If it worked, it would democratize healthcare. Patients could get tested at their local pharmacy, receive instant results on their phones, and detect illnesses like cancer or diabetes at the earliest stages. The potential market was endless. To sell this vision, Holmes understood she needed more than just a good idea. She needed a powerful story and an image to match. It was around this time that she began to meticulously cultivate her iconic persona. The black Issey Miyake turtlenecks became her uniform. She had learned from a family friend that Steve Jobs wore the same style, and she adopted it as her own. A visual shorthand for visionary genius, she began to speak almost exclusively in a deep baritone voice, a noticeable change from her natural higher-pitched voice that can be heard in earlier recordings. This vocal affectation projected authority and seriousness, a way to command attention in rooms filled with older, male investors and scientists. She was disciplined, sleeping only a few hours a night, adhering to a strict vegan diet of green juices, and dedicating her entire existence to the mission of Theranos. She wasn't just a CEO, she was a prophet, and she looked and sounded the part. In 2009, a pivotal figure entered her life and the company. Ramesh Sunny Balwani, nearly 20 years her senior, Balwani was a software executive who had made a fortune during the dot-com boom, when a company he worked for was acquired. Holmes and Balwani had met on a Stanford trip to China when she was just 18 and he was 37. They began a romantic relationship, a fact they kept hidden from the company's investors, board, and employees for nearly the entire duration of their time at Theranos. Balwani had no experience in medicine, diagnostics, or medical devices, but he had cash and a reputation for a brutal, results-oriented management style. When Theranos was on the brink of insolvency, Balwani provided a crucial $13 million loan. Soon after, he came on board as president and chief operating officer. With Balwani as her enforcer, the culture inside Theranos transformed into a state of corporate lockdown. The company headquarters on Page Mill Road in Palo Alto became a fortress of secrecy. The main entrance had bulletproof glass. Security guards escorted visitors everywhere, even to the restroom. Employees were forbidden from discussing their work with colleagues in other departments or even with their families. Departments were strictly siloed, preventing anyone from getting a complete picture of the company's technological shortcomings. An engineer working on the shell of the Edison machine had no idea if the chemistry inside it worked, and a chemist had no idea if the robotics were functional. Employee computer activity was monitored. NDAs were deployed aggressively. Anyone who questioned the mission, raised concerns about the technology, or even expressed mild skepticism was labeled a cynic, a non-believer, and was often swiftly and publicly fired. Balwani would patrol the offices, demanding to know what people were working on and why they weren't working harder. According to former employees, his management style was built on intimidation and fear. He was known for shouting at subordinates, and his emails were often aggressive, all-caps tirades. The message was clear. Total loyalty was expected, and dissent would not be tolerated. This suffocating atmosphere was designed for one purpose: to protect the central lie. And the lie was this: the technology did not work. The Edison machines, which went through several prototypes, were chronically unreliable. They were prone to breaking down, leaking fluids, and failing quality control checks. They produced wildly inaccurate results, and most importantly, they could only perform a very small handful of the tests Holmes publicly claimed. The grand vision of a single device running a full menu of hundreds of tests was a complete fantasy. The scientific challenges were immense. A single drop of capillary blood from a finger prick is not the same as a vial of venous blood from the arm. It can be contaminated with tissue fluids, leading to inconsistent samples. Furthermore, the sheer volume is a problem. There simply isn't enough blood in a single drop to be divided up and run through hundreds of different chemical assays with any degree of statistical reliability. The scientists at Theranos knew this, but they were trapped. They were ordered to defy the laws of chemistry and physics, and when they failed, they were blamed for not being innovative enough. So how did Theranos demonstrate its technology to investors, partners, and board members? Through carefully staged deceptions. When VIPs like then Vice President Joe Biden visited the Theranos headquarters for a tour, they were shown a carefully choreographed performance. For blood test demonstrations, the company would sometimes use a null protocol. The visitor's blood would be drawn and placed in the machine, but the machine wasn't actually running the test. The results that appeared on the screen were predetermined, sent to the display by a hidden operator. In other instances, they simply ran the tests on commercially available, third-party machines built by companies like Siemens, the very machines Theranos claimed to be making obsolete. They would hide these machines in a back room and secretly run the samples on them, while presenting the results as if they came from their own revolutionary device. The partnerships with Walgreens and Safeway were built on this foundation of deceit. To convince these corporate giants to sign on, Holmes and Balwani presented them with fraudulent validation reports. They took reports from pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and Schering-Plough, for whom Theranos had done some minor research projects on conventional machines, and altered them. They added the Theranos company logo and edited the conclusions to make it look like these pharmaceutical giants had validated and endorsed Theranos's proprietary technology. It was blatant forgery, a lie designed to secure deals that would lend the company an invaluable air of legitimacy. The Walgreens deal was the moment the lie escaped the laboratory and entered the real world, where it could do real harm, against the desperate warnings of their own internal experts, who could not get straight answers or reliable data from Theranos. Walgreens executives pushed ahead, driven by a fear of being beaten to the punch by their rival, CVS. The rollout, starting in Arizona in 2013, was a disaster. The Edison machines were not used for the vast majority of tests. Instead, blood was drawn from patients' fingers using the nanotainer, then secretly taken to the central lab. There, the lab technicians faced an impossible task. The commercial Siemens machines they were using were not designed for such small capillary samples. To make it work, they had to dilute the finger prick samples with saline solution. This practice was a grave violation of basic scientific protocol and a surefire way to produce inaccurate medical results. But in the world of Theranos, the appearance of success was all that mattered. The consequences were terrifying. One patient's test from Theranos suggested a dangerously high potassium level that, if correct, would indicate they were on the verge of a heart attack. A follow-up test at a traditional lab showed their potassium was perfectly normal. A man was given a test result indicating his PSA levels, a marker for prostate cancer, were spiking. His doctor, relying on the Theranos data, prepared him for the possibility of cancer. Again, traditional tests showed the Theranos result was completely wrong. A pregnant woman's results for the hormone HCG falsely indicated she was miscarrying, causing her unimaginable distress. These were not abstract data points. They were moments of terror, confusion, and anguish inflicted upon real people by a company that prioritized its own mythology over patient safety. Inside Theranos, the employees who knew the truth were living in a state of constant ethical crisis. One of those employees was Tyler Schultz. He was young, idealistic, and had a very personal connection to the company. He was the grandson of board member and former Secretary of State George Shultz. Tyler joined Theranos in 2013, excited to be a part of a world-changing enterprise his grandfather so passionately endorsed. He was quickly confronted with the shocking reality. Assigned to the diagnostics team, he witnessed the company manipulating quality control data. He saw how the Edison machines consistently failed their precision tests, yet the company would cherry-pick the few results that passed and ignore the failures, a practice known as throwing out the outliers to make the devices appear effective. He saw the dilution of blood samples and understood the catastrophic impact it could have on patient results. He tried to raise his concerns internally. He wrote a detailed, anonymous email to Elizabeth Holmes, outlining the scientific and ethical breaches he had witnessed. Holmes, instead of addressing the concerns, forwarded his email to Sunny Balwani. Balwani's response was characteristically aggressive. He replied to the entire diagnostics group, belittling the anonymous author, questioning his competence and understanding of basic math, and dismissing the concerns as cynical and ignorant. Shaken but resolute, Tyler replied, revealing his identity, and resigned from the company shortly after. His conscience wouldn't let him walk away. He tried to warn his grandfather, over several months, in a series of emotional confrontations at George Schultz's home. Tyler laid out the evidence of the fraud. He explained the data manipulation and the technological failures. But his grandfather, so thoroughly captivated by Holmes's spell, chose to believe her over his own flesh and blood. Holmes had convinced the elder Schultz that his grandson was young, inexperienced, and didn't have the full picture. Schultz told Tyler he was wrong, and that what he was doing would damage the company and, by extension, the family's reputation. It was a devastating betrayal. At the same time, another young lab employee, Erica Chung, was witnessing the same deceptions. She, too, found herself in an impossible position, working for a company she knew was endangering the public. Both Chung and Schultz would eventually become key sources for an investigative journalist who was beginning to hear whispers that something was deeply wrong inside the $9 billion startup. That journalist was John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal. The beginning of the end for Theranos started with a tip. In early 2015, Adam Clapper, a pathologist who ran a niche medical blog, received an anonymous comment expressing skepticism about the company's claims. Intrigued, Clapper did some digging and reached out to John Carreyrou, a two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist known for his meticulous and hard-hitting investigations into the healthcare industry. Carreyrou was initially skeptical himself. The board members, the investors, the Walgreens deal, it all seemed too big and too public to be a complete fraud. But the source was persistent, and the central question was compelling. How could a company valued at $9 billion have no peer-reviewed data to support its revolutionary claims? Carreyrou began to pull on the thread. It was difficult and dangerous work. The culture of fear at Theranos meant that former employees were terrified to speak, bound by ironclad non-disclosure agreements, and the very real threat of litigation. The company was known for its aggressive legal tactics, led by the celebrity lawyer David Boies, a man renowned for his ferocious and intimidating style. Speaking to Carreyrou meant risking one's career and financial future. Slowly, carefully, Carreyrou found people willing to talk off the record. He learned about the unreliable Edison machines, the faked demonstrations, the use of commercial analyzers, and the dilution of blood samples. He eventually connected with Tyler Schultz through an intermediary. Tyler, despite the immense pressure from his family and the threat of Theranos' lawyers, agreed to speak to him anonymously. He was followed by private investigators hired by Theranos, and his family spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on legal fees to protect him. Carreyrou also spoke with Erica Chung. These were not disgruntled employees with an axe to grind. They were young scientists who had witnessed a massive public health danger and felt a moral obligation to expose it. Their detailed, first-hand accounts, corroborated by other sources and internal documents, formed the backbone of his investigation. As Carreyrou's reporting progressed, Theranos got wind of it. The company unleashed the full force of its power and influence to kill the story. Holmes and Belwani went on the offensive. David Boies and his army of lawyers descended upon the offices of the Wall Street Journal, trying to intimidate the paper's editors into submission. They argued that Carreyrou was a rogue reporter with a vendetta, that his sources were lying, and that publishing the story would destroy a great American company and compromise trade secrets. They threatened to sue the paper. Elizabeth Holmes personally appealed to Rupert Murdoch, the owner of the Wall Street Journal's parent company, who was also, ironically, Theranos' single biggest investor, having put in $125 million. She pleaded with him to intervene and stop the publication, framing it as an attack on innovation. To his credit, Murdoch told her that he trusted his editors and would not interfere in the paper's editorial decisions. The pressure was immense, but Carreyrou and his editor, Mike Ciconolfi, held firm. They knew their story was solid. On October 15, 2015, the first bombshell article, titled "A Prized Startup Struggles," was published on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. It was a devastating and meticulous exposé of the company's deceptions. The story detailed how Theranos was not using its proprietary technology for the vast majority of its tests, and revealed that the company's former chief scientist, Ian Gibbons, had died by suicide, reportedly telling his wife that the technology did not work. The public reaction was swift, but Holmes was not ready to surrender. That very evening, she appeared on CNBC's Mad Money with Jim Cramer, staring unflinchingly into the camera, her deep voice steady. She delivered a masterclass in deflection and denial. "This is what happens when you work to change things," she said. "First they think you're crazy, then they fight you, and then all of a sudden you change the world." she dismissed the article as tabloid journalism, claiming the sources were disgruntled ex-employees who didn't understand the complex science. She was, in effect, trying to stare down reality itself. But the dam had broken. Carreyrou's article opened the floodgates for regulatory scrutiny. The FDA launched an investigation, finding major inaccuracies in the data Theranos had submitted and ordering the company to stop using its nanotainer for all but one type of test. More damagingly, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, or CMS, the agency that regulates all laboratory testing, conducted a surprise inspection of the Theranos lab in Newark, California. The findings were damning. The inspection revealed widespread failures, unsafe practices, and deficiencies that posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. The fallout was catastrophic. Walgreens terminated its partnership and sued Theranos for $140 million, settling out of court. The company was forced to void or correct 2 years' worth of blood test results, tens of thousands of tests that had been given to real patients. The $9 billion valuation evaporated. Investors saw their money turn to dust. The high-powered board members, one by one, began to distance themselves from the wreckage. In 2016, Forbes revised its estimate of Elizabeth Holmes's net worth from $4.5 billion to zero. Sunny Balwani, her secret partner and enforcer, left the company as the walls closed in. For 2 more years, Holmes tried to keep the illusion alive, attempting to pivot the company to focus on developing the mini-lab for other markets. But it was too late. The myth had been shattered, and the legal consequences were just beginning. In March 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Holmes, Balwani, and Theranos with massive fraud. Holmes settled the charges, agreeing to pay a $500,000 fine, surrendering control of the company, and accepting a 10-year ban from serving as an officer or director of a public company. But the SEC charges were only the beginning. The real legal battle was yet to come. On June 15, 2018, a federal grand jury indicted Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani on multiple counts of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The Department of Justice alleged that they had engaged in a multi-million-dollar scheme to defraud investors and a separate scheme to defraud doctors and patients. Theranos, the company that was meant to change the world, officially dissolved just a few months later. The legal proceedings against Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani were as complex and drawn-out as the fraud itself. The case was a landmark for Silicon Valley, a region where hyperbolic promises and disruptive narratives are commonplace, but federal fraud charges are not. The government's decision to prosecute was a clear signal that the fake-it-till-you-make-it ethos has its limits, especially when human health is at stake. The trials of Holmes and Balwani were separated, a crucial strategic move by their legal teams. This allowed them to point fingers at each other. The COVID-19 pandemic and Holmes's pregnancy caused significant delays, but her trial finally began in the late summer of 2021. The prosecution's case was straightforward and built on a mountain of evidence. They presented testimony from former Theranos employees, including lab directors and scientists, who described the technological failures and ethical breaches. They brought in investors who testified they had been misled by Holmes's false claims about the company's capabilities and its supposed contracts with the U.S. military, contracts which never existed. Jurors heard from doctors and patients who had received faulty test results, grounding the abstract financial fraud in tangible human harm. The prosecution methodically deconstructed the image, Holmes had so carefully crafted. They presented emails and texts between Holmes and Bolwani that revealed their awareness of the technology's failings, even as they were making triumphant public statements to the contrary. They played recordings of Holmes using her deep, affected voice in interviews, contrasting it with clips where her voice was noticeably higher, suggesting that even her persona was a calculated performance. The defense, on the other hand, faced an uphill battle. Their strategy was twofold. First, they argued that Holmes was not a con artist, but a true believer, a dedicated but perhaps naive entrepreneur who was let down by the scientists and engineers working for her. They tried to portray her as a visionary who believed her own hype, arguing that failure is not the same as fraud. Every startup hits bumps in the road, they contended, and Theranos was simply a venture that didn't succeed. Their second and far more explosive line of defense centered on Sunny Bolwani. Holmes took the stand in her own defense, a risky but necessary move. In her testimony, she painted a picture of Bolwani as a controlling and abusive figure. She alleged that for a decade he had exerted control over every aspect of her life, from her diet and her time with family to her business decisions. She accused him of psychological, emotional, and sexual abuse, claiming this coercive control left her unable to make her own decisions, and that she was effectively under his thumb. This Svengali defense attempted to reframe her from a master manipulator into a victim, shifting the blame for the company's deceptions onto Bolwani. The prosecution countered that Holmes was clearly in charge. She was the founder, the CEO, the face of the company. It was her signature on the fraudulent financial projections and partnership documents. The text messages, while showing a fraught and sometimes controlling relationship, also showed them as partners in the deception, celebrating media appearances and strategizing on how to handle negative press together. After a trial that lasted nearly 4 months and featured testimony from dozens of witnesses, the jury reached a verdict in January 2022. They found Elizabeth Holmes guilty on 4 counts of defrauding investors, 3 counts of wire fraud, and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. Significantly, they acquitted her on the 4 counts related to defrauding patients. The split verdict suggested the jury was more convinced by the evidence of her deception towards sophisticated investors than by the argument that she had willfully intended to defraud individual patients. A few months later, it was Sunny Bolwani's turn. His trial followed a similar script, but without the explosive testimony of Holmes herself. His defense team attempted to portray him as a mere investor who was just as duped by Holmes as everyone else. The jury didn't buy it. In July 2022, they found him guilty on all 12 counts of fraud and conspiracy he faced, a more sweeping conviction than the one delivered to Holmes. The sentencing hearings brought the long saga to its climax. In November 2022, Elizabeth Holmes, by then a mother of 1 with another child on the way, was sentenced to 11.25 years in federal prison. The judge noted her lack of remorse and the sheer scale of the fraud. Sunny Bolwani received a sentence of nearly 13 years. They were also ordered to pay $452 million in restitution to their victims. After years of appeals and delays, Elizabeth Holmes reported to a federal prison camp in Bryan, Texas in May of 2023, trading her black turtlenecks for a prison uniform. The case of Theranos is more than just a story of a failed company. It is a cautionary tale about the intoxicating power of a good story. Elizabeth Holmes wasn't just selling a product. She was selling a narrative. It was a narrative of empowerment, of a fearless female founder smashing barriers, of technology as a force for unequivocal good. She understood that in the modern world, and especially in Silicon Valley, the story you tell can be more powerful than the product you have. She wrapped her lie in the language of revolution and hope, and in doing so, she exposed the vulnerabilities in the very systems designed to prevent such a massive deception. The anatomy of this fraud is complex, with many interconnected systems of failure. There is the failure of venture capital, where the fear of missing out, or FOMO, led seasoned investors to abandon basic due diligence. They were so desperate to get in on the ground floor of the next Apple or Google that they invested hundreds of millions of dollars without ever independently verifying that the core technology actually worked. They invested in the myth of the founder, not the reality of the science. There is the failure of corporate governance. A board stacked with political and military luminaries, chosen for their reputations rather than their scientific expertise, served not as a check on Holmes's power, but as a marketing tool. Their gravitas created a shield of credibility that deflected suspicion and made it harder for the truth to emerge. They were, in essence, prestigious props in her grand theater of deception. There is the failure of the media, which, for the most part, uncritically amplified the Theranos myth, dazzled by Holmes's youth, charisma, and bold claims. Many journalists and publications celebrated her as a visionary genius long before her technology had been proven. They printed the legend without rigorously interrogating the facts. And finally, there is the anatomy of the lie itself, a lie sustained by charisma, intimidation, and an almost pathological self-belief. Elizabeth Holmes possessed a rare ability to make people believe what she wanted them to believe, even when the evidence was right in front of them. She projected an aura of such unwavering certainty that it seemed to bend reality around her. She compartmentalized, denied, and deflected, never allowing cracks to appear in the facade. The lie became her truth, an alternate reality she inhabited so completely that she could convince others to live there with her. But the story of Theranos is also a story of integrity and courage. It's the story of Tyler Schultz and Erica Chung, young employees who risked their careers and defied immense pressure to do the right thing. It's the story of John Carreyrou, a journalist who demonstrated the vital importance of a free and adversarial press in holding power to account. They, and the other whistleblowers who came forward, are a testament to the fact that even the most elaborate and well-funded deceptions can be dismantled by the persistence of truth. The black box that promised to change the world with a single drop of blood now sits in a museum, a relic of a spectacular implosion. It serves as a permanent reminder that ambition without ethics is a destructive force, and that in the quest to change the world, the truth can never be just another variable to be managed. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.